Hi everyone, this is Latoya. I'm just going to come on and talk about a few things that I've learned over time as I grow and as I experience more prophetic things. Let me just invite a few people. I'm also going to be tagging my coaching company, eMerge&See Co, into this live. I do offer prophetic lifestyle coaching, and so this might be a great a great discussion for that. So come on in. Let me just go ahead and tag eMerge&See Co, and then we can go ahead and begin. And thank you guys for coming. Oh no. Okay. Okay. Just give me one more moment and I'm going to begin. If you think this will be helpful for other people, please do share. I'm only speaking because I think it will be helpful for other people and I don't talk enough. So this becomes that moment for me to share. So please do help me out by sharing as well. Just tagging one of my business pages in. If you find that in this conversation that you need someone to talk to about some of these things, feel free to set up a free consultation with eMerge&SeeCo.org. It's free. Okay, so there we are. Let's go ahead and start. Hi, Mom. Hi, Bestie. How are you? Hi, Miss Letitia. I hope you guys are all great. I haven't been live in a while, so I just want to, share a little bit, not necessarily about what has been going on in my life lately, but this is not far from it. Oftentimes when I go through my woes, they're large woes, but they're often on account of spiritual encounters. And so this, in one way or another, I have some notes here about some things that I learn from having quite a bit of spiritual encounters, have them quite often, and things that aren't discussed enough. Because these things aren't discussed enough, it doesn't create the type of communities that will be safe enough for people who are like me, who are having all of these encounters. And this often leads to, breakdowns. So let's talk about them. And I'm happy to be a tad bit more vulnerable if you have other questions or if you want to know what that looks like, at least for me. Just feel free to ask. And also feel free to chime in. As I've already mentioned, I do have some notes here. So if I'm looking down, it's just because I'm looking at notes. And I've also already mentioned that I did tag eMerge&See Co, one of my coaching companies, or my coaching company. And one of the things that we coach on is prophetic lifestyle coaching. And yeah, a lot of it is very much catered to these things that I learn on account of spiritual encounters, things that are not said. So I promised you an hour ago that I'm going to say things that are not mainstream, and you can believe it, I will totally say things that are not mainstream. Feel free to fight me on this. I love really informative and really effective dialogue, and it only happens when you guys add to the conversation. So please do add to the conversation here. And if you are interested in any type of coaching or administrative services, just go to www.eMerge&SeeCo.org and you can schedule a free consultation and we can talk about meeting those needs. So one of the things that I have here on my list is, it's often the case that Christian teachings today, Christian ideologies and worldly ideologies in itself creates this notion that the world is very black and white. This is not true. The world is very gray. And the same is true of the spirit, actually. The spirit realm is extremely gray, very little, if any, black and white. And while we often think that the very little black and white that will exist in the realm of the spirit will be where God lives, that's not true. God lives in the gray. God lives in all of the chaos or all of the things that feel like total chaos. And for the most part, the gray is so daunting because it forces us to ask questions. It forces us to acknowledge that we aren't in control, that we don't have power. And those are the places we find God. So it's really important that we understand that God is in the gray. The spirit realm is not black and white. It is gray. So another thing that I'm learning, and this is one of the things that I'm having to keep reminding myself of, response matters much, much more than we know. A lot of us are taught when we have these prophetic encounters or experiences or impressions, that how we respond to them, right? What we do after we have them matters, right? Like you pray, you are an intercessor, right? This huge, mainstream teachings, right? You work through dream interpretation, unpackaging things of that nature. Way too normative, you guys. There is gray even in that area. And I'll discuss a little bit of that here. But ultimately, your response before and after matters, as we are taught, but your response during prophetic encounters matter very much so. One of the things that I find is sometimes my experiences within a prophetic encounter will, in one way or another, determine the extent to which I am left bruised from the encounter, if that makes any sense. Having spiritual experiences is very interesting because just as we live in the world as humans and we tether ourselves to the earth, on account of our relationships, our jobs, our earth-filled purposes, life in the spirit is the same way. And it works on you, just like life in the earth and all of the things you're connected to have a way of working on you. Same way in the spirit. And oftentimes, we get a little bit more scraped than we probably should be on account of negative responses to encounters. Another thing is lack of trust is often at work in these encounters too, especially if you're having a prophetic experience while having a prophetic experience. And I talk about this a little later, but it's very, very common for prophetic impressions to be within prophetic impressions. One of the things that kind of hinders some of my responses, for example, is before I go into certain, or I have certain visual impressions, I already know and sometimes often feel portions of what I'm going to experience in the visual impression. And sometimes that stops me from wanting to move forward, but I'm already having to deal with what I know. And sometimes when I don't want to deal with it, I just make things worse, essentially. Just become a big brat, which happens quite a bit, and it is okay. That is okay. Nonetheless, I can talk a little bit more about that if it's helpful to you, but I'll move on to the next, and all of this has to do with response as well. The partner matters. What I mean by the partner is the human gift matters. You matter. Far too much emphasis is on prophetic people using prophetic gifting, and there is not enough teaching. There is not enough dialogic spaces for the prophetic person, him or herself or themselves. And that's a problem. You have to be able to cope with being a prophetic person. It requires coping, just like every other, occupation, position, identity in life requires skills, not just skills on how to utilize the potential, but how to deal with the potential, how to embrace aspects of the potential. Mothers, they might become a mother overnight when they give birth to their first child, but the entire period of birthing, from, caring for this newborn to raising this, child who transitions through life, up until 18, to letting them go when they're adults and freeing them to make their own decisions, all requires coping. And it's the same way with every other portion or every other identifier, every other identity, and there's no difference here. The problem here, though, is there aren't a lot of spaces that are dedicated to helping persons with prophetic encounters or persons with high levels of sensitivity cope. These spaces are not often safe enough for honesty, storytelling, impression sharing, communal training, and very necessary discussions. I say this a little later, but the language we use is quite abusive and it is quite limiting, and that in itself also needs to change. And the only way that's going to change is if there are these spaces that are created for people to be honest and to talk about the ways in which the language does not work for them. And there are people out there seeing this stuff, hearing this stuff, feeling this stuff. They can offer a lens that isn't quite perceived or thought of by many. Speaking of such a community, eMerge&See is very interested in creating these safe spaces. So if you are a person who would like to be a part of a community like this, just go ahead and send me a private message, or you can even write a little note here in the comments, and I'll be in touch, because I do very much want to create that very safe space where it's not about there being one leader teaching others, but really a community full of learners, full of people who want to grow, but full of people who have themselves ways and abilities to grow others, right? Like the community is meant to be one where there is give and take, one that is effective for all. So if you're interested in that, just let me know. So I also wrote here in my notes that this isn't something that is true or that is just lacking for the so-called prophet or the so-called seer, right? But there are also communities that are lacking safe coping spaces for pastors, for evangelists, for teachers, for apostles, for whatever and however you identify. This has become clearer and clearer over time as we see many pastors who've been pastoring for years, sometimes even decades, give up their churches and choose to no longer pastor because they're burnt out. And it's not because they don't have leaders over them or people that they can talk to. But oftentimes what I think it is I think there's a lack of, communities that's going to, allow you to vocalize your burnt out feelings and work through them, and not vilify you for feeling burnt out or broken or unnecessary or purposeless or many of the other feelings that come with it. Heavy, people who are going to help you carry loads and not just, tell you you're meant to carry them. I think it's often the case for us to, not understand what's going on with the people around us, and we just kind of give them to God. I'm going to just pray for you. Prayer is great, but we need spaces where we can be real about what we're feeling and ask questions and work towards solutions. And solutions that even make it okay for you to sit in your feelings a bit. So, I also wrote here that something that is very important when you're talking about like you mattering, the person having the encounters mattering, not just the people you will help, not just the message that you carry, right? But who you are, the person that you are, is deeply impacted by your experiences, by your encounters, and processing that in a safe space is key. And I've already mentioned this, but there are people who don't quite make it on account of these experiences because they don't have sufficient communities. And what I mean by not having sufficient communities or having insufficient communities is, these communities, these insufficient communities, focus on the norm, what has been normative by their own experiences or by the mainstream. And in truth, there are very few norms at work when we're talking about how the Spirit works on, in, within, with human beings. Because we all process these experiences differently. And not only that, but on account of really poor ideology, we have been conditioned to vilify our own experiences, to call what is godly and divine demonic, for example. And we have been conditioned to not allow ourselves to experience, all that we can experience, as spirit beings on account of teachings that condition us to say, nope, that's not God. And that's a problem. It's okay to have prophetic encounters or spiritual experiences that are not normative. That's completely okay. And having safe spaces to be able to voice that is important. Sitting on your encounters and kind of keeping them secret in so many ways because you're afraid of the people who are going to call you manic or depressed or crazy or witches or something like that is quite ridiculous. And in one way or another, it silenced so many people to the point in which, you often think, you go through these moments and you have these feelings like there aren't anyone else out there. Elijah says this in 1 Kings. He's like, God, there are no prophets out there. No one who's like me, and God is like, nope. And then you read later on in the text that there was a person Obadiah, who hid 100 prophets when Jezebel was killing them. But nonetheless, there's these feelings as if you're the only one having these encounters, and you're not, but no one's talking about them. So how do you know who you can talk to, who you can freely discuss them with? And this is a problem. Not only is it a problem because the person, the partner of God, the person having the encounter matters, but it's actually a huger problem because it's preventing really important intel from existing and from being shared or being accessible in churches. There are things, for example, that are happening in churches that people are seeing and not saying anything about. And those things are really important for the building or for the growth of the ministry that they're sitting in. There are things that people are seeing about the body of Christ at large that go unsaid because these are things that they understand from, non-normative prophetic experiences, and they're afraid to speak up. Well, how do you know that? And it's kind of really sad because I think if people really got a good picture of the things that, people who are prophetically, who are having lots of prophetic experiences and people who are highly sensitive, I think it would be more so the case that church services or fellowship meetings or human existence in itself will be significantly better. And it is often these people who are accessing things that have been hidden from us, hidden often on account of religion, and that includes Christianity, these things that God is digging up and giving to people, but we're all silent. So it's really, really important for people to exist in communities where they don't have to label their experiences, where they don't have to where they can freely discuss their experiences, whether it's normative or non-normative, and not feel as though they are being labeled or their encounter itself is being labeled. Once again, this goes back to the first thing I said. The spirit realm is gray. Super duper gray. So it's okay to be non-normative. It's okay to have non-normative experiences. Don't fear the non-normative. Embrace it, embrace you. And these are really, really important things. I have to keep telling myself this all the time. Or I probably wouldn't quite exist in this way, if I'm being honest. Another thing that's at work when you're thinking about the importance of the partner, like the person experiencing these encounters, there are things that we often understand that others are unconscious to. And one of the things that I noticed over the past few weeks, maybe the past few months actually, that might act as a good experience of this is, it's less often the case that people think that they are pierced in so many ways, that they are worked on account of their prophetic experiences. But if you talk to them long enough, you ask important questions, you'll start to, help them to realize that they are made different in so many ways, on account of these experiences, that these experiences have a way of changing them. One thing, for example, that is always a big thing in my life, there are memories that I have, earthly memories, on account of spiritual experiences. So July the 4th just passed, Independence Day, and every time I hear fireworks, it doesn't matter, it doesn't even have to be Independence Day, there's a part of me that goes back to a dream I had 14 years ago about a nation that was massacred. Fireworks sound very much like automatic guns, and I almost have to catch myself, or I will find myself almost having like PTSD like symptoms, all on account of a dream. And I have lots of experiences where that happens. But if I'm not taking the time to actually ask questions, why do I feel this way? Why am I uncomfortable? What's wrong with this sound? Then I would not really have the consciousness, the ability to acknowledge that in one way or another, an encounter left me somewhat different. Where I used to love these fireworks, now I don't want to touch them or play with them. They're not play toys for me anymore. So, that's one example, kind of a really sad one, actually. I'm trying to think of a good one. So sometimes I have this, it's almost like this ringing in my ears, but it's not happening in the natural, it's happening in the spirit. And I become very, very sensitive to the noise, in the room. It can be the noise in the walls. It can be the electricity, or it can be the noise on the inside of someone else if I'm in a room with someone else. But it took me a really long time to realize that I was having these encounters, and I would be in one way or another really frustrated that there was so much noise in my ears and I could not figure out why, to the point in which I was thinking that something is wrong with me. It almost seems like a health condition or something of that nature, but it's not. It's just spiritual static, I don't know, in itself. So asking questions and getting people in a space where they feel like they can ask questions, they can get answers, or even just they can in one way or another be in a space where they can reconsider their own encounters, and they can develop the ability to ask themselves questions, more so effectively self-examine, contemplate, so that they can figure out what's happening in their own lives. And it might be on account of natural memories, but for others, it's on account of spiritual experiences. Which brings me to another point, actually. Everyone has their own dream language. This is something that's fairly normative, right? We all know this. Most of us know this. But a lot of things is not taken in account when you're talking about your own dream language, and why that dream notebook and the 5 or 10 that you purchase is sitting on in your bookshelf, why they never work for you is also because you're not interrogating yourself for your own, in regards to your own experiences, your own memories, and not just your natural ones, but your spiritual ones. Sometimes you can be having this encounter, in your dream, and it can be reminding you of that time you smelled cinnamon in a vision you had 2 weeks ago. Something really, really random. Your spiritual memories matter too. All memories matter. All stimuli matter when it comes to self-examination, when it comes to dream interpretation, when it comes to making sense out of and unpackaging these, hidden gems we receive on account of our spiritual encounters. Let's see. So I kind of hinted at this earlier, and this is really confusing to say. So I'm just going to say it. And if this is not clear, just be like, what? And I'll try to re-explain it in the comments, okay? So prophetic encounters are prophetic in nature. But this isn't just simply because they point to some kind of esoteric or like hidden or past, future, present, or future reality or something like that. But they're prophetic because prophetic impressions are often filled with prophetic impressions. So an example of this is when you dream, and in your dream, you are dreaming. So Toya is dreaming. Dream Toya is dreaming. And so now there is essentially a double dream Toya, if that makes any sense. It happens. It's real. But even when that's not happening, it is often the case that prophetic impressions are within prophetic impressions. And so while a lot of people kind of teach these very sanitized ways of writing down your dreams and interpreting them and processing them or whatnot, what is really, really important is not that you just simply write what you see or what you smell, or, what you hear, whatever the impression or the more dominant form of medium of getting the impression is. But you also need to write every bit of other form of stimuli too, even those that seem somewhat secondary. Like, you might be having a dream or a vision. You need to write what you smell. You need to write what you taste. You need to write what you think. You need to write what you're remembering. You need to write what you are feeling. But you also need to write what you know, because there are things that you see, that produce a knowing. And then there are things that you don't see that you just simply know. And it happens in dreams too. I had one of these experiences maybe a few days ago, and I had this dream about someone, and I just randomly text them and was like, hey, here's a dream. And if they didn't ask other questions about their state in the dream, we would not have really successfully interpreted it. Because I, like, a lot of what I was receiving in the dream, it's a dream. I'm seeing things, right? I'm hearing things. I'm existing as this, dream self. But my dream self had knowledge and knowings that I would not have been able to access without her asking questions. Well, what was I doing in this dream? What kind of job did I have in this dream? What was my purpose in this dream? And it was really shocking, to me at the moment. But I was able to blurt out all of this stuff, like, unknowingly. When I wrote her the dream, these things weren't in my writing. They weren't in my original recording, because I just did not think of all of the knowledge that Dream Toya had in this dream. And there were questions I could not answer. But it was very, very clear that there were knowings, like Dream Toya had knowings in this dream that did not make it onto paper the first time around. So write everything. It's It's also very, very important that you think about your disposition before you sleep, after you wake up, and also the dreams you have before and after, because often they are connected. Not always, but sometimes there's a connection. So, next point. I say this all the time, you guys. We find ourselves, for the most part, conscious of potential realities. A lot of people see things and visions or hear things, and in their minds, they are actual realities. They are things that will come to pass. That's a problem. We must not think about our impressions immediately as things that will come to pass, but things that more so can come to pass. Things that can represent someone's present state, potential realities. Almost like those Marvel movies where they're the same characters who live in multiple universes. These universes in so many ways become different because they're different actions, and therefore these actions require different responses, things of that nature. We see potential realities. It's really important that we are taught this over and over and over, that we think of these things over and over and over, because discernment must be exercised here to help us distinguish between what becomes something that is, potential and what is an actual reality. Yes, we ought to always pray. This is what the Bible tells us, right? But sometimes prayer is not simply, prayer, I'll say in air quotes, because we always want to communicate with God about what we're seeing, and about proper responses. But sometimes, attacking the spirit realm is, and trying to war after the ceiling that's in your church is really not the proper response. I've seen this time and time again. I'm sitting in churches, I'm seeing a glass ceiling. That's why things are slightly dry. Or maybe things are not dry, but people are clearly longing for something else, and I can sense it. They're sick of being in this same place that's good, but can be better. And there's a huge ceiling. A lot of people would see ceilings and they would say, oh, we need to, use some warfare and attack that thing. We need to break that ceiling. Often, all that needs to happen is the people need to be more conscious about charging their spaces. Charging the atmosphere. That's a potential that we have as humans. It's a potential that I get to see come out of people sometimes, come out of people and interact with earth or the ground and things of that nature. People charge atmospheres. That's why services, have these moments of highs and lows. It's not necessarily the church leader or the pastor, and sometimes not even the praise team. Sometimes it's the people right in the pews. It's the parishioners who are doing the work of charging the space. And sometimes it's all that's necessary. Acknowledging there's a ceiling here and expecting people to charge the space. And it doesn't need to be charged through warfare. Some ceilings are not there because, of some kind of diabolical enemy. So prayer is not always the path, it's not always the response. And I should also note that sometimes our prayers are not meant to divert some kind of event from occurring, but more so to provide peace, in a situation that is going to happen. Someone, for example, you might be seeing that someone you really love and care about is going to pass away, and your response is meant to be that you're there to comfort your family and help them cope before the passing so that they're strong enough to deal with the passing. It doesn't mean you're saying, oh, so-and-so is going to die. That might be your deep hidden secret, but you might be doing other things, responding in other ways to kind of strengthen your family members, or even to help them cope with what it's like to take care of someone who's really sick and someone who's whose relief of pain is not going to come through a surgery or through medication or through divine healing, but through a transitioning of life. Sometimes prayer is also necessary to more so request strategic understanding on how to develop trainings or some bit of material regarding these things you're receiving in your impressions. This is often the case for me. I'm not like one of those people heavily involved in the whole warfare thing. I do it if I must, but it's rarely something I ever think about. But a lot of my impressions teach me things about the spirit realm and help me understand things that people need to be conscious of. And while at first I didn't have the language to communicate these things well, over time I started developing the language to communicate these things in ways that are much more easy to understand, and I'm still working on that process. But I would be not so great at describing what's happening to me. This was 10 years ago. Now I can tell you exactly what's happening. You'll be like, wow, that was well said, but what do you do with that? Which is really interesting. Nonetheless, sometimes, trainings and teachings and ways to evolve the body of Christ or move us forward is more so, the response to your impressions than, fighting demons or something like that. And speaking of which, deliverance, healing, the prophetic, all these things kind of need to be, what's the word? They need to be more normalized. They need to be, in some ways, even destigmatized, right? Like, these aren't things that occur when you're just in church or you're surrounded by your Christian friends. Salvation is something you choose every day in your own little home, your own space. And deliverance is something that occurs over time and over the course of your life. It's not something you wake up to tomorrow and you work through for 2 weeks and then you're done and over. No, it is something that is ongoing. And it is something that should be less spooky as a result of it. The prophetic, the same. We're all of a prophetic heritage. We all have something to share, something to give. It is just who we are. We should have less fear about being able to share and exchange thoughts and prophetic impressions and experiences. Yes, so this stuff definitely needs to be normalized and I don't know, made less scary. The word is at the tip of my brain, but I can't think of it right now. So I already mentioned this a little. Our language is not great. Our language is not working, you guys. It's just not. Everyone who has prophetic encounters aren't prophets, for example. But prophets aren't just simply people who work in a church or serve a kingdom purpose within a religious space either, right? We have to really figure out what this stuff is. And if we're going to think of the prophetic more vaguely, then it might make sense to think about all of the ways in which we are prophetic in our very different areas of our lives. I've often done this with my Bible Institute, Amana, when we talk about marketplace ministry, and I talk about how very prophetic teachers are in the classroom with their students, and how very natural it should be for parents to be somewhat prophets in their household, telling their children who they are and giving them the tools to become who they're meant to be. It's a very prophetic thing, doesn't mean they're going to go out there and, prophesy to the whole church, but it also doesn't, if we understand these things in more broad ways, then we can understand the ways in which we all perform a very similar work. And it just becomes more important for us to think through where we should exist at this moment. What is your sphere of influence becomes more so the question here. So I'll give you another example, and just briefly, because I'm not really sure that I completely have the language for this. A lot of people think that end time prophets are people who are declaring the word of the Lord and encouraging people to repent and discussing things that, are to come to pass or are to be as the world comes to a closure, or even preparing people for that. But I think there have been end time prophets and are end time prophets today who have been doing it, or prophets who've been doing it end time work. People who've been doing an end time work forever. Because being or having an end time assignment isn't about, seeing an end of times, but doing something about the decaying nature of the earth. And this is, this is one of the things that's very, very clear in my impressions during and pre-COVID. God really cares about this earth. And there's almost, in so many ways, like this alarm system in the earth that kind of signals when its decay will result, or will eventually and very quite soon result in the lack of preservation of the earth and its creatures. That includes us. And then there are life-saving or divinely divine life-saving initiatives that are at work to preserve the earth and preserve humankind. We see this in the Bible. We certainly do. It just takes a lot to find it and understanding of what's happening in the text. But we've seen it now. And in some ways, some of the things that we've vilified in this time have been some of those tools utilized to preserve the earth, not just for the sake of the earth, but for the sake of us, for the sake of humans. It doesn't always feel like it. Another thing that people are less conscious of is that the earth is spirit and has voice, and in so many ways partners with God in ways that are quite painful. And we think that I think if we understood that, then we would understand how uncomfortable our own partnership with God can be at times. The earth literally, gives birth time and time again and goes through this endless cycle of life and death for the sake of preservation. And it's no different with us when you really think about it. Nonetheless, if we had better language, people who are conscious of this can speak these things and not be vilified, not feel as though they've just been in some ways excommunicated, from their places of worship, from their communities, or marked as in divination, marked as weird or strange, marked as someone who needs to be left alone, marked as I don't know what to do with her or him, our language needs to change so we're not vilifying the people that we love, because this is some real stuff, you guys. And just because we're not all conscious of it doesn't mean that it's not real, doesn't mean that it's not existent. And doesn't mean that it's not godly. That's the important part. Some people, for example, are having experiences with transitioning spirits. Human beings who are transitioning out of this life into another. We cannot consider that demonic. We can't all read Saul's narrative where he goes to a medium and tries to talk to the spirit of Samuel. We can't all read that as a demonic incident. The spirit realm is real, you guys. And all of this stuff that happens, it's not demonic. There is gray. And another thing is, and I'll get off my soapbox after this, I promise. I never understood how it is so often said in charismatic Christian circles that there is no originality in the kingdom of Hasatan, Satan, the devil, whatnot, and that he pretty much imitates the things of God. But we have strict black and white sides to things where we think of things like astral projection as something that's instantly demonic, and we don't ever think about what in the world might this be imitating according to our own language. So you might have people who are not tied to witchcraft at all who might be doing this at young ages. I had a friend, a cousin really, who was experiencing this at a very young age. It became her burden to carry in silence because she didn't know how to talk about this without being vilified as a very young elementary school kid of being in witchcraft. This is a problem. Our language has to change. So, off my soapbox there. One of the things that I'm definitely learning in my spiritual encounters as well is curiosity is healthy and is expected. You are expected to be curious. God is shrouded in mystery and is inaccessible completely in all of God's goodness and all of God's godness, because you are meant to be a lifelong explorer. You're meant to ask questions. You are meant to keep asking, keep seeking, keep finding, keep knocking, right? Which is actually might be a better way of translating Matthew 7, if I'm being honest and thinking correctly about the Greek. And because of this, you're expected to be curious. You are. And many of us have been taught not to ask questions or to stay away from curiosity. So much so that we all hear that common cliche, curiosity killed the cat. It's ridiculous because curiosity has saved much more people than it has killed. Because curiosity is not the thing that kills. I will tell you the thing that makes this problematic, and it's not always bad either. It's an ambiguous thing that can make curiosity seem problematic, and it is your response. It's not curiosity. It's your response. You can be curious. You can do that Google search. You can go on over to YouTube. You can ask questions. You can hear people's stories. You can try things even. But it is your response. And then it is how you respond to the experience that works on you on account of your curiosity that opens the door to propositions. And not all the time are those propositions poor. But sometimes those propositions can lead to things like spiritual or physical oppression or mental oppression. But they can also lead to illumination and enlightenment. So we need not fear curiosity, but we need to critically think about how we are responding to every bit of life, how we are responding to our curiosities. And I want to be really careful here. I'm not saying don't explore. I am saying, yes, explore. But as you encounter things on account of your exploration, your response matters. And you have to realize that. You have to understand that. Your response matters. So it is often not the ritual or the act that is the problem, but the response to it that becomes problematic. And I think this idea of these responses in so many ways working on us as everything else in life does, right? This is very natural, might help us to kind of normalize self-examination, contemplation, and really being informed and making informed decisions, right? Because it's really about your response. I cannot stress that enough. It is your response that can be the problem. And I have to stress this, especially in my life on account of my spiritual experiences, because sometimes I literally ask God, why did you do this to me? I didn't ask for this, you know? And in some ways, I'd like to experience what it feels like to be more connected to earthly things. Like, I'd like to know what it feels like to exist more in this earth, right? Because sometimes so many of my experiences are spiritual that it feels like I exist less here and more in some other place. And that leads to, me more so asking God, what the crap? Then what am I doing here? Like, I need friends that I can regularly talk to about this stuff. I need good relationships. I need things that tether me to this earth, or else this earthly body is useless. And it sounds really bad when you say those things, but it's just the truth, in one way or another. But one of the things that I have to keep reminding myself is what God has done to me, how God has made me, it's less of the problem. It is not the problem. It's how I'm responding to it. If I just sit here and brew about my encounters and about how they make me feel and about the isolation that I often encounter as a result of it, and I don't do anything about it, I don't step out and create communities for people like me. I don't step out and talk to other people about how I respond to my crazy encounters and how I've had to deal with my conservative upbringing, how I have to challenge it daily, that kind of thing, then I'm going to find myself in this position that is quite isolating. But if I share more and create communities that are full of this type of sharing, then perhaps there is release. And there are more people to uncover all of these hidden jewels that God wants to uncover in this time. And that always sounds pretty great, actually. So yes, I'm done with my notes, you guys. Any questions, comments, concerns? Let me look through these comments. Yeah, the book of Numbers can definitely do that to you. But one of the things that we have to keep in mind when we're reading the Bible is it's written for a certain type of people and for a certain purpose. And oftentimes helping people to think about the things that they probably should not touch means that this is how Jewish rabbis say it, that God created a boundary around the boundary, and they think of the law as the boundary around the boundary. So when people touch that boundary, they touch the hot stove, they're not going to get burnt because that's actually just really modest of a boundary. It's actually protecting even the more a more important and no touch zone is essentially. My personal view is that we are all very, very liminal beings, all of us, and prophetic encounters, prophetic people are just liminal. We exist on boundaries. This is something we have to deal with. And we have to deal with in ways that do not vilify ourselves. And therefore offer new readings of the Bible, of biblical texts that will not always do the work of furthering that vilification. That's deep. Water is super vague. So maybe you could text me more about that. Water is super vague. Very, very vague. It can be something that is really amazing, and it can be something that's maybe not so amazing. And it can be quite powerful in element. So, just as every element, it is very, very gray. Water is life-giving it is often connected to refreshing and peace and healing, but it is also very all-consuming and is connected to things like drownings, death, destruction, right? So understanding what's happening in your dream, all of those other factors will help us to understand the use of water. And I think people undercut all of the elements as, you know, in our interpretation, because none of them are inherently good or bad. They're all neutral. In fact, people themselves are more so elemental, and we all have elements that we're so deeply connected to. Like, I see it in spirit all the time, people who have mantles of fire and water and wind. And there's something really beautiful and very destructive about each and every one, which is quite interesting. You know, that something so life-giving and something that is so destructive can exist, coexist, you know, in very powerful ways. But yes, any other comments or thoughts? Okay, so if no other comments or thoughts, I hope you guys have a great day. Thank you for coming. If you are interested in such a community, a prophetic community where you can freely discuss what's happening with you and freely hear and listen and learn and grow others, not just grow yourself, but have a role in growing others, DM me. I am building such a community. So we're going to be learning how to cope, not just grow our potential, but how to deal with it, which is very important, how to think through effective responses. So just DM me. So if they have a mantle of those elements, does that mean it's a good thing? All mantles. I don't think I've ever seen one mantle on a person that didn't have a connection to an element. One time I even saw this lady. She still does. She has like a mantle of armor. It kind of looks like armor, but the connection is to the earth. So all mantles in one way or another are connected to some bit of element. And yeah, mantles are good things. They are in so many ways symbols of access and ability, right? You can almost think of them as like the police badge on a police uniform. It gives you access only because it is a symbol of it, you know? Yeah. There are other aspects to mantles that are not very comfortable. But yeah, I think the thing that determines your use of it, or whether it's good or bad, will be your use of it in so many ways. You know, how do you use your garment? And some people have multiple garments, not just one. So, yeah, it's kind of hard to think of any of this as inherently good or bad, because it's not. Mantles are just gray. I hope that kind of answers your question. Okay, awesome. So I love you people. I hope you have a great day. If you have other questions, feel free to, put them in the comments or DM me. I'm happy to come back to the video and answer your questions. And I'll probably post this to my personal YouTube page as well at some point. So feel free to add me there and, follow my journey to getting to embrace myself more. Love you, sis. Talk to you guys later. Love you, bestie.